the name was 4 letters, 2 syllables, and had a Z in it. And Steve Sandoz, I said, so how'd you come up with that? And he said, well, I pulled it out of my ass. And, so if you were a runner, you never run behind Sandoz. But it was just one of those things that once we did a bunch of research on it, we found out that actually in one of the Romani languages, it meant the river of life. And so there were all these kind of karmic, kismet, whatever you want to say, things that were happening, including the New Age movement, which was really taking off in a more mainstream way. Had always been around, but had been kind of too woo-woo for the mainstream. But at the time we were working on Tazo, or creating Tazo, I should say. Acupuncture wasn't that strange. People doing meditation wasn't that strange. What was strange, what was really truly strange at the time, was yoga, which is kind of almost amazing to even think of now. But back then, if you knew somebody that did yoga, that was the person you left at the party and tried to, start up a conversation with somebody else. But that all changed within 10 years of that brand launching. So there was just a lot of fun, and it was maybe from a creative standpoint or from a design standpoint, probably the one project and we worked on it for about 11 years. One of the things where my sort of personal experience, my history of letter forms, my interest in history even, and just sort of visual poetry in a way, was developed and expressed through that brand, maybe more so than many of the other projects that we're well known for. And all of that came out of, the fantastic sort of collaboration between Steve Sandoz, my sort of creative partner, and Steve Smith, who was the team maker, and amazingly creative and gifted and talented person in his own right. And so, I think, and then the support of Steve Lee. So those 4 Steves, really had kind of something going at the time. And it eventually sold to Starbucks.
That must have made for some pretty amazing and funny stories at the time, too. Steve. Hi, Steve. It's Steve.
Oh, my God.
And Steve will be joining us.
Yeah, there were a lot of, in which one? So there was a lot of use of last name only.
Of course.
Even by like spouses.
You come home at the end of the day, you've got to delineate who's
exactly.
who in your own mind. In presentations that you've done, you've talked about the difference, and you touched on this a little bit with Tazo. You've talked about the difference in speaking to masses through advertising and branding, and then speaking to the individual through packaging, kind of a funnel or megaphone visual, at least. Can you expand on that a little bit? Because that particular product, as well as so many of the things you do, touch on that in the work you do, it seems.
Yeah, there was actually a time where we were making a presentation to Miller Brewing, and it was to help. We were actually being interviewed to see who they were going to work with for the kind of hoped for resurrection of Miller High Life. And so this the late 90s. And there was a brand manager named or a VP named Jeff Carefoot there at the time. And he actually did this little drawing, which was a megaphone shape. And he said the way that he looked at marketing out there at the end of the megaphone, the widest part of that acute angle. And he said, this is a bunch of people out here. We're talking to a lot of people, and we can kind of focus the megaphone to the group, that large group, that large body. And then at the very, very tip, the very point of the megaphone, the mouthpiece, so to speak, he said that's where packaging lives for him. That's actually talking only to one person. It's in their hand, and that relationship is completely intimate. Now, in between, there's things like point of sale, and there's PR, and there's some other touch points that kind of fit within the megaphone. But the reason why they were interested in the work that we had been doing, and Tazo was an example of the work that they referred to, was that work was so compelling to the individual that it really wasn't in need of advertising to support it. It was so strong in its own sort of relationship that it made advertising a not an unnecessary thing, but a thing that you could delay, something that you could probably generate interest just by packaging alone, which was, I had never really thought about it that way. And again, that's one of those things where, people with more experience or other experiences sometimes can teach you a lot about even the stuff that you do. And so, yeah,
Of course.
so that model was actually his model, and I've referred to that many times since as a teaching tool, and it's been pretty helpful.
Let's talk for a minute about listening. Ironically enough, you put a lot of emphasis on listening to the needs of both clients and consumers in branding. Is there anything that you've discovered in that process that's not being attended to enough?
Yeah, well, we have, you mentioned the word process a few times today, and I'm sort of a skeptic of it. Clients always want to know, well, what's your process? How do you get to this? And clients tend to be MBAs for the most part, and processes, sort of fundamental and important to them, and they want to know. So, they want to know how your system works, because just someone being creative is pretty freaking scary to business people.
That's a loose cannon with money,
isn't it? Yeah, so I think, and especially when it kind of comes to listening, it's not just our listening, it's just people in general. What do we value, or what do we pay attention to, or how do we listen, and what are we hearing, and what are we listening, or how do we evaluate what we hear or what we listen for? Because it's really easy, I think, to look for things that confirm our own bias. I think that everybody does that. So if you put that in the business world and you're trying to get your client to do something that may not be typical, then you have to like move them away from their own bias, maybe, or eliminate some kind of threat or fear, which is another difficult thing, in that and this is a David Brooks comment: Americans fear failure more than we want success.
Agreed.
And so, or my wife would say, as if that was a person, that person would be an away from instead of move towards.
Yeah.
You're more likely to walk away from something than to dive right in, and it's like um, it's hard to be open-minded in the face of ambiguity. So it's these are challenging things, and I think that's why why do we do so much research? I'm not against research. I just don't know how much faith you can put in it. I think it's another process, just like our own sort of gut checks. And if you're a creative person, you're kind of working off your awareness, or working off your own personal experiences. So I was a fine artist in college. I was a drawing and painting, printmaking major. I didn't do graphic design. I learned that on my own. But I had a painting professor who one time said, and I'm not sure who he was quoting, but he said, "The sane mind cannot create something it doesn't know." So we're always kind of drawing from our experiences, and then it's a matter of how we connect the dots, or how we make the stew. It's like, oh, I know a little of this, I know a little of that, I feel a little of this, I've seen a little of that, and how we sort of combine and cook up something that feels a little fresher. It doesn't feel as typical, or isn't a perfect mimic of something else. That's where the magic is. It's how we sort of cook it up. But none of that really matters if it isn't relevant, or if it isn't solving a problem, if you're working commercially, right? So listening is about trying to hear as much as you possibly can what the needs are and what the goals are, and then it's a matter of kind of going back interpretively, and figuring out what kinds of things could we do to achieve that, and also questioning, do we believe that? Do we fully support that, maybe that question or that problem that's presented to us, and might we need research to help us evaluate that, um, or do we trust ourselves? Do we trust what we know? Do we trust our experiences? And do we trust that we're sort of in tune with culture? And these are all. I mean, this is all sort of philosophical stuff, but so I'm not a student. I haven't read any of this, but I've heard about philosopher named Karl Popper, who wrote this. I don't know if you'd call it a theory necessarily, but he talked about clock thinking and cloud thinking. And the difference is that clocks are precise mechanical things that can be, taken apart and examined, and you can tinker with them. And clouds can't be taken apart. They're complex, and they're also this kind of holistic system. And his point is that people are like clouds. We're not so much like clocks, but we typically try to solve problems in our industry, marketing problems, using clock thinking, holding that consumers are these rational individuals who will respond, kind of in straightforward ways to incentives or whatever.
Right.
And yet, you know, we really need to take into account that they're way more complex. That, there's so many things that affect who we are, and just nature, layers of predispositions, desires, biases, hopes. There's so much that we need to acknowledge that is about subconsciousness causing us to do what we do, and not just about the practical, measurable things. And so